So if I'm a vegan and if I'm a raw vegan, I'm barely getting enough protein to be alive, my leucine percentage is horrible, then yeah, to add some essential amino acids in there. But then anyone who's eating a ton of protein, really good high quality protein and focusing on protein, taking just the essential amino acids is a complete waste of time and money.
Welcome back to another episode of the Peak Performance Life podcast. Today, I am very excited to be going into a methodology, a topic with an expert named Ted Naiman, Dr. Ted Naiman, a board-certified family medicine physician in the Department of Primary Care at a leading major medical center in Seattle. And his personal research and medical practice are focused on the practical implementation of diet and exercise for health optimization. And he's the author of the PE diet, which I'm really excited to speak with you about today and learn a lot more from him about it, because the PE stands for protein to energy ratio, and it explains every single diet phenomenon. The PE diet breaks down the cause of the obesity epidemic and the solution using this one powerful weapon. It's not a paleo or keto or low carb or low fat or plants versus animals or calorie counting. Instead, this is one master concept that explains the success of every single dietary strategy out there. So this is what we're going to go deep into today. And Dr. Naiman, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Oh, yeah. No, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Amazing. Well, let's talk a little bit about the background and how you got interested or how you kind of discovered this methodology of the protein to energy ratio.
Gotcha. Well, so I was a little bit confused about diet. I was raised vegetarian and trained in medical school at Loma Linda University, which is this sort of famous vegetarian plant-based place, right? And yet I didn't feel I was particularly any healthier than anybody else, and a lot of people around me weren't either. And then when I started practicing medicine, I saw so many people who were having success with different strategies that were completely opposite of what I was doing, like people going on Atkins diets or very low carb, eating a lot of meat, losing a ton of weight, reversing their diabetes. And so I was super confused, what's going on here? Obviously plant-based is the best when you're in Loma Linda and it's a blue zone and everyone's vegetarian or vegan. But then all these patients on they read a $5 Atkins book and just eat a bunch of meat and lose a ton of weight and totally normalize their blood sugar. And so I'm really confused. And so I just spent the next, 20, 25 years researching anything I could find on a lifestyle and diet and exercise and things that move the needle on body composition and metabolic health. And when it came to diet, I really had to just go all the way back to the very, very basics of, what the heck is eating. And it turns out that, animals are only alive because they just constantly ingest other living organisms. We just continuously either ingest plants or animals that have eaten plants. And as it turns out, plants are the base of the food pyramid for everything on the planet. So plants create all the food for animals, and you either eat an animal or an animal that eats plants. And what plants are doing are two separate things. They're creating high energy carbon chains from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere using sunlight. And that's either carbohydrate, which is a high energy carbon chain, or hydrocarbon, which is fat, and that's another high energy carbon chain. But they're all just carbons with oxygen and hydrogen attached to them, which they're getting from water, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and is powered by sunlight. So you've got plants doing photosynthesis to make energy for all of your animals, the carbon chains of fats or carbs. And then they're also sucking nitrogen and other minerals out of the soil. And nitrogen, of course, is this key differentiating factor in protein. So plants are doing two sort of separate things. They're storing solar energy as carbon chains, and that's carbon fats. And then they're sucking nitrogen and other minerals out of the soil and making proteins, which are these totally separate things that your body mostly uses structurally and for function and not so much for energy. So you can kind of look at your whole diet in this protein to energy ratio where protein represents the nitrogen and minerals that plants are extracting from soil. And then energy are these high energy carbon chains that are either carbohydrates or hydrocarbons, carbs or fats, which seem to be totally interchangeable. And then we have humans living all over the planet with varying levels of carb fat intake. It turns out that the biggest differentiator in hunter-gatherer groups as to the carb fat split in their diet is the distance from the equator, or what latitude you're at. If you're right on the equator, you eat more carbs. If you're at a higher, farther north, you're going to eat more fat. So there's not a huge difference in outcomes in these hunter-gatherer groups when they skew their diet wildly between carbs and fats. But what is very tightly conserved throughout is the protein percentage of the diet. So there's also this protein leverage phenomenon that we can talk more about. But as it turns out, looking at your diet from a protein to non-protein energy point of view is extraordinarily powerful. And one of the biggest factors when it comes to just ad lib caloric consumption, or just eating to satiety, how many calories are you going to eat? So that's kind of how I got into. That's a very long, rambling answer, but that's kind of how I got into this. And I just was so confused by all the carb versus fat wars out there that I kind of went back to the basics and just researched what the heck is eating, and realized that carbs versus fat might be a little bit of a lateral move, and really not the might not be the biggest or best question we could be asking.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Let's continue by, can you explain to everyone wondering, what is this protein to energy equation? And I know that you talk a lot about how different foods provide you with different levels of satiety, right? So, and this is very interesting. I've always known this as well, because, the counting calorie crowd, it will always just say, well, it's all just about calories in versus calories out. And I'm like, well, certain calories might make you more hungry or give you more cravings, and then you'll eat more, right? So there's different levels of satiety here. So yeah, can you explain a little bit more, break down this protein to energy kind of this methodology, this concept that you've come up with?
Absolutely. Okay. Well, first of all, I didn't come up with this at all. So this was actually discovered by Professors Raubenheimer and Simpson, these two researchers in Australia who have looked at nutritional ecology, which is basically the interaction between the food environment and biological outcomes in all sorts of different organisms. And they have been researching this nutritional ecology stuff for a very long time. And they sort of invented a nutritional geometry, which they've researched in every animal you can think of, from insects to mammals, all the way up to humans. And basically any animal will eat foods in its environment with a ratio of protein to non-protein energy. So, they started their research out with locusts, and they would give the locusts a high protein food and then a higher energy food, carbs or fats. And the locust will essentially eat more of one and less of the other, and vice versa, to always achieve this sort of same ratio or balance between protein and non-protein energy. And as it turns out, most animals in the wild will actually do that. If you lock an animal up and they have a high protein food and then a low protein, high energy food, they'll eat some of both of them and kind of achieve the same mixture. And you can find out what each species kind of prefers in terms of the protein percentage and the protein to energy ratio of what they're eating. The problem the problem arises when you lock an animal up and they only have one food that has a fixed protein to energy ratio. So for example, if you had a bear in the wild, it would eat salmon, it would eat berries, it would go back and forth between the two, get a pretty much perfect ratio of protein to carbs or fats, and everything's great. But if you locked a bear up with nothing but, let's say, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to eat, which are, maybe 10% protein, unfortunately, which is fairly low, the animal has to make a choice. Like, what is its compromise going to be? Is it going to undereat calories to avoid gaining fat and getting fatter, or is it going to overeat to get enough protein and just get fatter in the process? And the answer to most organisms most of the time is that they are going to overeat in order to get enough protein to function and survive. And in the process, they will be forced to overeat a bunch of non-protein energy calories, which are stored as fat, which is why if you locked a bear up with nothing but peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, it will unfortunately gain a ton of weight and basically be fat. And that's why it's this lower protein or protein dilution of food supply and foods in the environment that creates obesity in wild animals that live near humans and eat, human junk food out of the trash. So all of your, your dumpster raccoons and bears and animals that are either directly under human care or close to humans are ending up eating some of our junk food, which has a horrifically low protein to energy ratio and is unfortunately very obesogenic. So this is a super powerful phenomenon that's really conserved in most organisms, and it's basically called protein leverage. So you're going to eat until you get enough protein. That's how humans are wired. That's how most animals are wired. And if you are forced to overeat non-protein energy in the course of getting enough protein to survive, then you're just going to store extra fat. And it's this protein dilution of refined carbs and refined fats that has really been the biggest single contributor to the obesity epidemic. And it's an incredibly powerful phenomenon. A decade or two ago, when Professors Rappenheimer and Simpson came up with this, it was called the protein leverage hypothesis because they weren't really sure. But now it's been tested in all kinds of species, and it's definitely an absolute fact. And it's a very powerful phenomenon. It's really eluded researchers for decades because there's such little variance globally in protein percent. So you can look at humans all over the planet, and there's this massive difference in carbs versus fat eaten. So if you look at places like Scandinavia, like Finland and Norway, and some of these far north places, they have a super high fat percentage. But in like Japan, the fat percentage is really, really low. In Africa, the diets are extremely low in fat. But in the US, they're a lot higher in fat, or someplace like Germany, very, very much higher in fat. However, protein is just laser fixed at this, 14, 15, 16% protein in all of these countries on average. And it's because the protein was so similar everywhere that researchers said, well, that can't be a factor. It's got to be the carbs or the fats, which is it? But it turns out that is because protein is so prioritized, it's so tightly controlled that it actually exerts a much bigger leverage over the amount of calories an animal eats compared to carbs or fats. So it's just a crazy powerful phenomenon that nobody knows about and everybody should know about. And that's kind of why I wrote this book, The PE Diet, to just really shine a light on how big a deal this is and kind of open everybody's eyes to what's going on here.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting stuff. And by the way, you have lots of testimonials on your website, and as well as your own personal transformation. Once you've gone through this diet, you look absolutely jacked and ripped on that website in your pictures. So yeah, clearly there's results here. So it's very interesting because a lot of people focus a lot, like you said, on the carbs and the fat, but it is interesting because people who tend to take in enough protein, whether they're eating lots of carbs or not eating lots of carbs, either way, they seem to be doing in general okay. But I guess when you have some sort of imbalance, we know that eating more carbs, you'll gain more weight, right? And I think your theory, or what you're kind of saying here, is when you eat more carbs, you now have to eat more to take in the amount of protein that you will need. Is that correct?
Correct. Right. Basically, if you dilute protein with either carbs or fats, you're going to increase calorie intake.
Very, very interesting. So what are some of the biggest mistakes people are making right now then in their diets, and how can they start to understand and better use this protein to energy ratio?
Well, the first one is not realizing how important protein percent is when it comes to ad lib caloric consumption. So you can take any lab animal and just feed it higher or lower protein percent diets. And as the protein percentage goes higher and higher and higher, the animal will just eat less and less and less. You can feed a lab rat 20% protein, 30% protein, 40% protein, 50% protein is about the highest it ever gets. In research, you could go higher, but your animal is going to be very thin and very hungry and very unhappy. But as you crank this protein percent up, you will just simply see a lower and lower and lower caloric intake, all the way up to about 50% of calories. It's very hard for any human to live at 50% of calories from protein. You're hungry all the time. But we do see this effect scaled up in exactly this manner in all of your bodybuilders and bikini models and aesthetic athletes. As they're leaning out, doing show prep, the protein percent of their diet will go higher and higher and higher. It's very frequently as high as 30%, 35%, 40%, maybe a week or two before a show, 45%. I mean, you're seeing these incredibly high protein percentages in physique athletes, and it really, really does work. They're still hungry, but they're less hungry than they would be without this extreme protein prioritization. Of course, the protein is doing two things for them. It's improving satiety per calorie, so they're not starving out of their minds, but it's also, as they lose weight, it's preventing them from losing any lean mass. They can still support building and maintaining lean mass by just eating protein and then shaving all of the caloric deficit from carbs and fats, which are really just there to support your fat mass. So protein supporting lean mass, carbs and fats are supporting fat mass. If you want to have the highest ratio of lean mass to fat mass, which is what everybody really wants, let's be honest, then you want to prioritize protein over non-protein energy. And that's what every single bodybuilder and bikini model is doing. They might, there's a very difference in carbs versus fat spread. Some bodybuilders are super low fat and super high carb. Some of them are very high fat and very, very low carb. But they're all prioritizing protein, and the protein percentage is all very high. And that's the main thing that stands out. And so this phenomenon scales all the way up and down, from extremes of leanness to just your average person. So the things that people are getting wrong, to answer your question, is number one, being unaware of the importance of protein percentage and how big a deal it is. And then number two, being unaware of like how much protein is in a food and how much protein they're actually eating. You talk to people about, are you eating enough protein? They're like, oh, sure. I have an egg every morning for breakfast. Well, okay. An egg is 6 grams of protein, and you're going to need at least, I don't care who you are as an adult, you're probably going to want to eat triple digits grams of protein per day, 100 grams or higher, if you're interested in improving or optimizing body composition. So the 6 grams of protein from your one egg is a really good start, but it's just not going to get it done. You know what I mean? You're wanting at least 30 grams of high quality protein with each meal. And so if you drank a whey shake with that egg, or had a scoop of whey powder and some Greek yogurt, or just ate some cottage cheese or something like that, that might be a massive upgrade. So protein, awareness of the importance of protein, and then being aware of how much protein is in foods and how much you're actually eating or not eating, in the case of most people at breakfast for sure, is just a really big deal. So the mistakes are not being aware of the importance of protein, not being aware of how much protein you're eating or how much protein is in foods, and then getting distracted by things like carbs versus fats or plants versus animals, which are totally lateral moves and not really directionally important, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I eat 5 eggs to get my 30 grams of protein in that meal, right? So
right,
yeah,
exactly.
I'm curious in terms of like, let's say like a pound of grass-fed meat or something like that, right? Or even an egg, right? Let's use those two examples. What percentage of those foods, right? Because I actually had a couple of carnivore guys on in the last few months here on the podcast, and they are both, they're both in their 50s, both absolutely jacked and ripped and look amazing. They swear by the carnivore diet. They look and feel great. Their labs look great, and all they're eating is a lot of meat. Just I mean, pounds of 2-3 pounds of meat every day. Most of them only eat 1 to 2 meals a day. It's very interesting. But in that situation, because when you said they typically only get up to 30-40% protein, I was thinking, oh, wait, well, if they eat a steak, isn't that higher protein? But what's the breakdown there on like a steak or beef and eggs?
Got it. So if you just look at a typical, an egg, for example, is 6 grams of protein, 6 grams of fat, equal grams of protein and fat, which gives you about 30% of calories from protein. So an egg is 30% calories from protein. Now, it just so happens that if you look at worldwide hunter-gatherer macronutrient intakes, they're all up at about 30% protein from calories. Which is super high, and which is why they're all super lean without even trying. So an egg is a fairly perfect food. It's right at this 30% protein, 6 grams of fat, 6 grams of protein. You have to do the math to see what the percentage of calories is, since the protein is 4 calories per gram and the fat is 9 calories per gram. But you'll have to trust me, it's about 30%. Protein by calories. A ribeye steak, same thing. Or your classic ribeye is about 30% calories from protein and 70% from fat. And the way it breaks down is about 25% of the weight is protein. So a pound of steak, that's 450 grams or something, about 100 grams of protein in it. So a pound of steak has about 100 grams of protein in it. So if you just eat a pound of meat a day, you're doing great. And that's kind of why carnivore is just pressing the easy button. So if you look at, so it's called bioaccumulation. You know how if you're in the ocean, if you eat small little fish, you don't have to worry about mercury poisoning. But as those fish get eaten by bigger fish and then bigger fish, and you have like a super predator fish, like a tuna, it's eating the mercury bioaccumulates as it goes up the food chain, the trophic ladders. And so your higher predators are going to have higher accumulation of certain minerals. The same thing happens to nitrogen and protein. So plants have fairly low nitrogen. That's why a cow has to, eat a lot of grass to get enough protein to be okay. But as you go up the food chain, the nitrogen bioaccumulates, and you have to eat way less cows to get enough protein than you have to eat grass to get enough protein. So if you just look at plants versus animals in general, animals as a category have higher protein percents than plants because they bioaccumulated nitrogen. And that's why eating animals is such an easy, instant win. You just hit the easy button compared to plants. I like, that concept, but you can do it wrong. What ends up happening is that you'll have a vegan bodybuilder who's really intelligently just focusing on the highest protein foods they can. They're eating soybeans and tofu and edamame and seitan and wheat gluten, and they're just eating a ton of concentrated plant protein. And then they're just ripped and jacked out of their mind, and they have better results than like you or I and half the carnivores will ever have. But then you have other people who are on a carnivore diet, but they're just buying cheap processed meat hot dogs, which have a bunch of added fat just to make them economically more profitable. And that could be as low as, 16, 18% protein by calories. That's not good. That's pretty much just standard American diet. So if you're eating just sausage and pepperoni and super cheap bologna and processed meat and hot dogs, and your super cheap 65, 45 ground beef or your 70, 30 ground beef or worse, you're actually not going to really go very far. You might lose a couple pounds from just glycogen because you're eating no carbs and you're losing all your muscle glycogen, but you might stall out hard. You throw in there some concentrated carnivore fat sources like heavy cream and butter and high-fat cheese and all your high-fat dairy, and those protein percents are hideous. And you might actually start going backwards. As a physician, I've seen people literally get fatter and more diabetic on a carnivore diet by doing it wrong. And so, while for the most part, as a first order approximation, going carnivore is an instant win for protein percent. But you can actually do it wrong, and you can actually do it right, plant-based. And so it's better to be intelligent enough to parse out the differences. And then you don't have to be super dogmatic. You don't have to have carnivore in your name on Twitter or X. You don't have to be like I'm the carnivore king. I can actually eat some plant foods, focus on the ones that are higher in protein percent and nutritional value. And you don't have to be tied to one approach. You don't have to be just low carb and then everybody who's low fat is the enemy. You don't have to be just vegan and everybody who eats meat is the enemy. You can, it really frees you up to kind of rise above all the diet camps and dogma and just be agnostic to things like plants versus animals or carbs versus fat and pick and choose. And that makes it more flexible and more sustainable and less stressful. And you don't have to be as orthorexic, and no food is completely off the table. And everything's just on this spectrum of protein percent or protein versus energy or satiety per calorie or however you want to look at it. And so I do like carnivore. I mean, it's brilliant because it's so easy. It's just brain dead easy. But like at the end of the day, I'd rather people have more knowledge about what's really going on under the hood, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, for sure. And I look, I love the idea of carnivore as well, but there's no way I'm eating, 2 pounds of steak for lunch or waking up in the morning and eating a steak for breakfast. I just can't do it. Some people can. I wish I could. I just cannot force myself to eat heavy steak, things like that early in the morning or even in noon. I kind of save those meals for dinner typically. So again, having more I think the point is having more flexibility. If you can do that kind of stuff, great, more power to you. But I think the key of what you're saying is having a little bit more flexibility. Quick question on the plant versus animal protein, because again, the carnivore guys, they come on here and they say, well, plant protein's not the same. It doesn't even count. It doesn't have the same effect that animal protein does. And then obviously vegans will say it's here are the studies that show that it's the same. So I'm curious what your thoughts are. Plant protein versus animal protein, are they essentially the same?
Well, okay, every single food with protein in it is digested down into the same 20 amino acids and absorbed into your bloodstream. And your body doesn't know or care where those 20 amino acids came from. So it doesn't matter. But however, it's the spectrum of aminos you get from these foods. So when you have when you eat plant protein, you have the exact spectrum of amino acids you need to build a plant, which is a little bit different from an animal. When you eat an animal, you have the exact spectrum of amino acids you need to build an animal. And that is a little bit better. So like leucine, for example, which is super critical for triggering muscle protein synthesis, your leucine in your gold standard animal proteins like egg whites and whey powder, it might be 12% leucine. And then your, soy powder is going to be, 6-7% leucine or something like that. So you're not getting quite as good a spectrum of amino acids. You can overpower that with just sheer quantity. So if anyone's eating, a gram per pound of ideal body weight of protein, I almost don't care where it comes from because you're going to eat enough. Basically, if you eat about 30% more of these plant proteins in overall quantity, you totally override this spectrum issue, and it isn't a problem. So anyone who's eating a ton of protein, really prioritizing protein, going hard on the protein is going to be fine no matter where it came from. Now, the problem is when you're really flying your protein plane 10 feet off the ground, for people who barely get the RDA for protein, which is honestly everybody. Like I said, the average female in this country is eating, upper 60s grams of protein a day, 65, 68 grams of protein a day. They're barely getting by. And at that point, it is kind of a bigger deal. Like if you have your average female who's just barely getting enough protein to survive, suddenly says, okay, I'm just going to be a raw vegan starting now. And if they still, first of all, they're going to struggle to get the same absolute quantity of protein unless they're really intelligent about it. But secondly, all of a sudden, if they do happen to eat the same grams of overall protein, the amount of leucine they're eating is lower, and that's going to be a factor. So I am very worried about protein quality for people who are barely eating enough protein. Then you absolutely would do better with an animal protein for sure, especially a gold standard animal protein like a whey or a egg white. But you can always just whatever protein you got, eat more of it, prioritize it harder, get the absolute quantity up, and then it kind of isn't a big deal. You can get by with whatever you want. But so there is a difference. In general, animals have a higher protein percentage and a higher quality protein for animal purposes, for what you want protein for in your body, basically. So it's important to not just be dogmatic and say, oh, that's why everyone should just be pure carnivore all the time, but to know what's actually going on there. And then you can be a little bit more intelligent about it and have a little bit more options. You know what I mean? Another problem with pure carnivore is that humans do have an appetite for carbohydrate. You have to have, maybe 70 grams of glucose a day just to be alive. For the cells in your body that can't burn fat, your brain cells and some cells in your kidneys and your red blood cells, and some of these cells need glucose, and you will be manufacturing 70 grams of glucose daily, the hard way out of protein, which further chews up more protein, by the way. And so if you don't eat a certain amount of carbohydrate, you will have this weird carbohydrate hunger all the time, which is not sustainable for the vast majority of the planet. And B, you will also, it's not very protein sparing because you have to manufacture enough glucose to be alive out of protein. You can't make very much glucose out of fat. So saying, okay, just don't ever eat any carbs ever is actually starts going the opposite direction of helpfulness. So like most people eat way too many carbs, right? Your average American's eating 300 grams of carbs a day. You really only need about 100 and then maybe a gram per minute of high intensity exercise. So, at best, people need maybe 150 grams of carbs or whatever, but we're eating 300. So going lower carb is a win for most people. But then saying, okay, if lower carb's good, zero carb is the best, and then just be pure carnivore and never eat carbs, that's actually going too far the other direction. It is on a U-shaped curve. And when you go to zero, you have this problem with hunger because humans have an appetite for carbohydrates. So if you're not eating some, you're going to have this weird carb hunger that is hard to satiate with just protein and fat. You're also having to use some protein for gluconeogenesis, which might not be the best use of that protein. And so that puts some people further behind when it comes to protein intake. So yeah, anyway, that's some of my pushback against the pure carnivore, pure religious, zealot, dogmatic carnivore. Well, I like the general idea because it's protein. I think this taking it a little bit too far, and you've gone past the sweet spot down to the other side, which is kind of bad also.
Yeah. Yeah. Quick question on what do you think about essential amino acids, right? Especially ones that are kind of made in a blend with a ratio of higher leucine. Is that effective as well? Would that count as protein intake to you, in your opinion? I take these essential amino acids. I know a lot of other people, especially people who are working out quite a bit, are taking these essential amino acids. What are your thoughts on those?
Got it. Okay. So and again, it comes down to quantity. So if you're eating adequate protein, you're better off with a whole protein rather than the essential amino acids. And that's because even though, 9 are essential and 11 you can make, the 11 that you can make, a lot of them there are some conditional factors where if you don't have enough of them floating around, your muscle protein synthesis might be lower or your muscle protein breakdown might be higher. So having all the aminos there is better for building and maintaining muscle. And just taking the essentials only is the sort of thing that I think is helpful if your protein altitude, if you're flying your protein plane 10 feet off the ground, you actually might benefit from taking an essential amino acid supplement, especially if you're a vegan and your protein sources are low. in leucine. So if I'm a vegan and if I'm a raw vegan, I'm barely getting enough protein to be alive, my leucine percentage is horrible, then yeah, to add some essential amino acids in there. But then anyone who's eating a ton of protein, really good high quality protein and focusing on protein, taking just the essential amino acids is a complete waste of time and money. So it depends on where you're at. I don't ever bother, and I don't recommend it, because I just tell people to just consume all the amino acids and just have more protein. You know what I mean? I'm worried about the macro view, like are you eating enough in general? And then you don't have to pay extra for the essential ones.
Yep, makes sense. Makes perfect sense. So let's transition a little bit into, I know you made an app and you kind of have this system of the protein energy kind of system that you have here. And now you have a new app that helps people see it. And specifically, let's talk a little bit about like satiety. And I know in your new app, you have certain foods that have some sort of satiety index. And again, this is, I think, a really overlooked concept. And I think we've done a good job explaining the background about why the protein is so important and kind of the background there. But a lot of people, again, don't realize, they're just like, oh, calorie in, calorie out. But certain calories, and this is why I think carnivores can just eat, a huge meal of steak or this one guy said he eats 3 pounds of beef and that's his one meal a day and that's all he eats. And the satiety on that, right? I don't know how you can eat that much in one sitting, but the satiety index on that is probably through the roof, right? Whereas obviously if you're eating sugars and sweets and high sugar processed foods, the satiety index is going to be very low. So even though, okay, maybe even if we're saying, counting calories and a calorie is a calorie, okay, but certain calories are not going to satiate you. Therefore, you're probably going to eat more later on. And that's where I think this satiety index is really, really important. So talk a little bit about satiety and how you come up with a satiety index and how your app is kind of working with all that.
Oh yeah, sure. Absolutely. Okay. So, I've been talking about how important protein to energy ratio is and protein percentage and how it's this major driver of overeating and blah, 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 blah. Okay. That's great. But there are a number of black swans to the protein thing. There's tons of societies where the protein percent is actually pretty low, but people are completely ripped and jacked and super healthy. I mean, look at the Catawans with, maybe 12% protein intake, but half their diet is these very rough, high fiber sweet potatoes with incredibly low energy density and incredibly high fiber, and it makes up a massive amount of their diet. And so they're actually getting a really high satiety per calorie and able to just eat to satiety without overeating calories by eating foods that are not high protein, but instead low energy density and high in fiber. And it turns out there are all these other factors. There's this hedonic factor where I could eat, 200 grams of protein and just all the steak I can hold. And guess what? When the dessert tray comes out, I'm still having a chocolate eclair, right? So there's this hedonic factor that's a huge big deal. There's energy density that's a huge big deal. There's if you're eating carbohydrate, the percentage of fiber versus non-fiber carbohydrate is a massive big deal. So I branched out from the protein. I wrote this book, The PE Diet, looking at this protein percentage, protein to energy ratio, probably the single most important driver. But now I'm writing a book called Satiety per Calorie, and it's looking at these other factors as well. Energy density, which is probably the second most important factor. Fiber, the percentage of calories from fiber, which is a huge factor if you're eating a lot of carbs. So the biggest differentiator of healthy carbs versus unhealthy, or carbs that you're going to overeat or not, is the percentage of fiber to non-fiber carbohydrate in those foods. And then there's this hedonic factor, which it turns out is a combination of high energy density carbs and fats together. So if you mix a fairly low protein but high energy density carbs and fats together, it's so tasty and rewarding, and there's so much dopamine that people just really crave these things and really overeat these. That's your Reese's peanut butter cup. It's like 10% protein, 45% carbs and fats together. and it is so high energy density and so tasty and rewarding, you're just going to overeat that every single time. All of your donuts and your pizza and your cakes and cookies and pies and muffins and crackers and all these things are high carb, high fat together, high energy density, fairly low protein, fairly low fiber, fairly low water, and they're all really easy to overconsume. And that's when I developed this concept of satiety per calorie. It's like, how full do you get for how many calories was in what you ate? And when you look at foods that way, you start to realize that the biggest problem in our food supply is the refinement of energy calories. That's either refined carbs, sugar, flour, refined fat, butter, oil, whatever, and things like alcohol, which is just pure refined energy calories. And I'm working with Dr. Andreas Einfeld. He's of Diet Doctor fame. He's the head of the CEO of Diet Doctor, and he and I have created this HAVA app, HAVA. It's powered by satiety per calorie. So there's this 0 to 100 scale of how satiating a food is for how many calories are in it. And your steak has a satiety score of 67. It's pretty awesome. You don't want to be at 100 because that's just celery and whey powder, and you can't live there. You'll be starving out of your mind. That's what you might do if you're trying to be a bodybuilder. But down at 0, you've got things like Oreo cookies. It's this crazy high carb, high fat, high energy density combo that's so tasty you're just going to eat the whole box of those things. And the hedonics are off the chart. And so your goal is to be, somewhere in the middle, 50, ideally higher than the standard American diet ends up scoring in the upper 20s on this score. So like your standard American diet, 27, 28, 29. Most people, if they can get to about a 50, they're like home free. They just eat to satiety and they just gradually get thinner. But it's looking at protein percent. There's 4 major factors that go into the satiety score. Protein percentage, huge. Energy density, the number of calories per gram, very, very huge. And that's mostly like water content. So if you look at like grapes versus raisins, for example, the amount of calories you're going to eat from grapes versus raisins is insane. And it's almost a 2x factor in terms of ad lib caloric intake from grapes versus raisins. And that is purely driven by energy density. It ends up almost doubling. You can feed humans 2 meals. We have studies where you feed people 2 meals that seem to taste the same and have similar stuff in it, but one's got double the energy density, one's got half the energy density, and you will literally eat twice as many calories with the double energy density, and you'll have the same hunger and fullness scores on both diets. So we have these crazy studies where people literally eat half or twice as many calories just eating satiety and feeling fine either way. So it turns out humans eat a certain weight and volume of food every day. You're going to eat 3 to 4 pounds of food every day, almost independent of how many calories are in there. So you're just going to eat 3 pounds of food. Now, if that 3 pounds is the Katavan sweet potatoes, that's only like, 1,000 calories. But 3 pounds of potato chips would be, 8,000 calories. It's absolutely insane difference in calories with certain foods. The potato chip is dehydrated. There's no water, there's no fiber, there's no protein. It's just pure starch and oil, the highest combination you can get of refined carb, refined fat. You sprinkle some salt on there to increase the hedonic factor. And so we invented this app. It's called Hava. You can go to hava.co and check it out. You can download the Hava app right now on the app store for, either iPhone or Android or whatever. And basically what it's doing is allowing you to take a picture of your food. It automatically tells you what, all the ingredients, all the quantities, all the calories, all the macros, protein, carbs, fat, but it gives you a satiety score. It helps you hit a protein target because you want to eat a certain amount of protein, but keep your satiety score at a certain range. So you're not eating foods that are going to basically make you overeat either hedonically or just because you have to get enough protein.
That sounds amazing. So you just take a picture of the food and then you have gone in and kind of entered your formula for pretty much any type of food that someone can take a picture of and they can see. And how much grams is it? Do you kind of follow the 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight? Is that what you like to see people hit?
Absolutely. So my advice to most people is a gram per pound, not of how much you weigh, but how much you would weigh if you had absolutely perfect, flawless bodybuilder stage body composition. You know what I mean? So if you were at your absolutely flawless, perfect fighting weight, about a gram per pound is a really good target for most people.
Oh, that's good to know. So if someone weighs 200 pounds, but really if they were at 8% body fat or something, they'd be 170 pounds, then they should shoot for maybe 170 grams of protein per day.
Right. And so you could look at like a reference weight for your height, like how much should you weigh if you had, if you were perfect for your height, and then that would be a protein target.
Excellent. That sounds fantastic. I'm really excited about your new book. I think there's so much talk about the counting calories debate, and I just love this book of like the satiety index per calorie. That is so important. I don't think I've heard anyone else talk about it. So I'm very excited that you're doing that. Very excited that you've created this app. I highly encourage people to go check it out, download it. And this has been an absolute pleasure. I really love this whole protein to energy methodology and this book that you've written and the app that you're doing. Is there anywhere else where people can learn more from you, follow you, find you?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I'm on all the socials at Ted Naiman. I'm on X. I'm on Instagram, Ted Naiman. You can check out the book I wrote, The PE Diet. It's either at thepediet.com or pretty much anywhere books are sold. And then if you go to satietypercalorie.com, you can get a link to the Hava website, or hopefully later this year, I'll come out with the Satiety per Calorie book. So that's in the works.
That's amazing. I can't wait. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I hope we can do it again soon.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, can you please leave us a rating or review and subscribe? I've realized that while we have actually increased our downloads a lot, we're actually getting a lot of downloads, which I'm really happy about. We actually have very few ratings. And I realized that I've never asked people really to rate much. So I'm asking you now if you could please rate and review and subscribe. And if you enjoyed the episode, please forward it along to anyone that you think will get value out of this. Also, if you haven't checked out our line of products at buypeakperformance.com, you get 20% off your first order. That's www.buypeakperformance.com. We have some incredible products, including our organic high-altitude coffee. If you don't know this, coffee is one of the most heavily sprayed with pesticides out of any crop. So it's really important that you drink organic coffee. We've gone above and beyond to source what we believe is the highest quality and healthiest organic coffee in the world. We're also famous for our organic green superfood powder. You can get 20% off of that as well at buypeakperformance.com. We also have an organic vegan and paleo plant protein. See, most of the vegan proteins out there are using brown rice protein, which is really not a good source of protein, and it's also a grain. And if you're paleo, you know that grains tend to cause inflammation in some cases for some people. And so we wanted to make one that was paleo friendly and vegan and organic. We made an amazing amino acid profile, so it's really one of the best plant proteins for muscle building. So you can check out Peak Performance Organic Plant Protein. You can find that on our website. Of course, all our products are on Amazon as well. So thanks again. And again, please, if you enjoyed the episode, please forward it along to someone who you feel can get value out of it. And please leave us a rating, review, and subscribe. Thank you.